Hi. Hello everyone, and welcome to yet another ACE Your Assessments podcast. Just to make sure that we're recording this and moving on to our topic for today. Before we talk about that topic, though, just want to say this is a milestone. It's number 15 podcast that you have been able to watch, to give you food for thought, and hopefully share with your colleagues as well, with your peers in your groups. Hopefully, it's very helpful for you so far, and obviously, you're here because you want to know more. And again, today is number 15, and we're going to talk about how to avoid plagiarism in legal writing. And we've got with us Dr. Rachael Eater. Welcome, Rachael. Thank you very much for coming today. I am going to introduce you very quickly, if that's okay.
Yeah,
So,
thanks for
y-
having me.
yeah, thank you so much for coming. Obviously, you're volunteering your time, and everyone is, so students should know that. Out of the goodness of your heart, you're here today to impart wisdom. We want to know everything you know about this topic. So, you are a senior lecturer at DMU, and you specialize in international human rights law. You've got some various focuses as well, because your research focuses on European Court of Human Rights in recognizing domestic abuse as a human right violation, but also in protecting the victims. And you teach over several modules. You've got teaching for international law, human rights, immigration and refugee law, and land law. But also, in addition to your teaching, you are an awarding gap lead. Oh, can you tell us a little bit about that? Because not very
Yeah.
often that we hear that title.
Yeah, so thank you, Eleanor, and it's great to be here, as I said before. But thinking about the awarding gap, so when we talk about the awarding gap, for those who maybe are not familiar with that, when we talk of the awarding gap, we're talking about the gap or the difference in the number of good honors degree that we get for between white students and Black, Asian, or other ethnically minoritized students. So this is something that is a sector issue. But here at DMU, we're taking measures to ensure that that gap is closed. So I get to look at that in the law school, and so my focus then is on the law school, but it has wider implications, of course, for the university as well.
Yeah, sounds good. And I hope that that's good news for the students as well, because we're trying as much as we can um, to be here for them and to support them in any way that we can. But there
Thank
is
you.
also another role that you are um, happy to happy to fulfill, which is APO, Academic Practice Officer. What about telling us a little bit about that too? I'm sure students
Yeah.
want to know about this.
I know. So when we think about academic practice officer, I mean, ultimately, the thing is that we want to see good academic practice. I think that's where we start from. We want to encourage students in good academic practice. And so as APO, part of the role is explaining what good academic practice is and ensuring that students are aware of what they need to do. But the other side of the coin is then if there is bad academic practice or academic misconduct, we also get to hear those cases and make decisions in those cases. So hopefully, I don't get to see any of our students who is listening to this podcast.
Yes, yes. I hope you just say hi on the hallway or in your lectures or
Yeah,
seminars.
yeah.
Yeah. So guys, pay attention, please. Ears wide open. How about I ask this of everyone that comes on the podcast, share something that you would like the students to know that probably they don't know, even the ones that you've had previously. Do you want to share something about yourself?
Yeah, I'll be happy to share something. So, students may or may not know that outside of academia, I do enjoy the great outdoors. I love to do stuff outdoors. I love to be active. So whether it's running or walking or hiking, in the Peak District especially, or even more locally where I live, just to go out and do stuff. And I love to share my journey as well on social media. So I do post regularly just to talk about different things people can do to be active, because I love to inspire people to get active and get moving, especially going outside to get some fresh air.
I love that, and it's very good for students to take that message. I mean, it's absolutely brilliant to be in the fresh air. So if, especially if you've done a lot of work for an assessment or an exam
Mm,
that you worked on, just get
yeah.
out and um, get some oxygen in that brain of yours.
Yeah, yeah. And you know,
Definitely,
Elena, it's really good
I like
physically,
that
but it's also good for like mental health, just
for the
for it
mind.
just
Yes.
changes something. Yeah. So yeah, encourage it.
Definitely. That's really good. I like that. Now, again, I also ask everyone that comes on the podcast, I want to know why you think this topic is so important for us, how to avoid plagiarism in legal writing. I know it's a bit obvious, but still, why is it, or why do you think it's important?
This topic's really important, as we think of, especially when we think of it from academia. Students are here pursuing, the degrees, and in doing that, one of the things you're going to have to do is be assessed so many times in the course of the 3 years, for example, of that degree. And when we think of assessments, then plagiarism then becomes very important when we will expand on what it is as well, obviously. But um, avoiding plagiarism is important because it ensures that the student is able to achieve their best outcomes from their degree. It ensures that there is good professional practice as well, prepping the student actually for later on after completing their degrees. But it really goes to the issue of academic integrity as well, and ensuring that during the course of their study, they're able to present their own ideas, but also they get recognized for their ideas and what they contribute in the course of their assessments.
That sounds good to me. It is important. It's very
Mm.
important. Um, but so when we talk about plagiarism, what do we mean? What is plagiarism in the first place? When you're writing, or when you're writing an academic paper, because obviously we can talk about other types of plagiarism.
Mm.
Just plagiarism generally for our purposes. What is it? Do we spread
Yes.
it on a cracker?
I mean, it's not a term you come across, would you? In your day-to-day life, it's very much something that comes when you think of academia or professional practice. Um, but in a simple way, I think we could say plagiarism is presenting words or ideas um, that have been taken from someone else without actually acknowledging the source of that information. So it's almost like trying to pass off work that actually belongs to someone else as your own work. And that is the key thing with plagiarism. It's that um, not acknowledging the source of your information.
Okay. Well, any common mistakes that, when we talk about that, maybe it's not intentional. And I think as lecturers, we come across that a lot, don't we? And we
Yeah.
think, is it intentional or is it not intentional? How do we know?
That's a very interesting question, and I think from what I've observed, when you've actually looked at student work, and sometimes actually also in hearings as well, you find that I think you can talk about intentional and unintentional plagiarism. So it is, I think plagiarism is something that is easily done if we're not very mindful when actually, let's say, writing an essay, for example. Because as you know, if you're going to present a piece of work, you would have to have read some information. We're not creating new information from scratch. So let's say it's a law essay, you would probably want to find out what has been written about that. You're probably going to look at some case law, maybe read some articles and things like that. Now, a common mistake a student might make is to read this information and then maybe copy parts of the text, maybe parts of a journal article, for example, without citing, without putting a footnote after it. So copying, literally lifting portions verbatim from that piece of work without acknowledging it. Or it could be that they've taken a portion of it and just made slight changes. So if I make just slight changes to just a few words, really the essence is still that piece of work. And
Mm,
I do need to acknowledge that source. So I think sometimes it's easy to do it without sort of thinking about it, especially when it's not a verbatim copy. You might think, well, I've already changed two or three words. It must be fine. But actually, what we need to be doing is paraphrasing and completely presenting the idea in our own words while still sticking to retaining what the particular source was talking about. So I think that's a very common mistake. And sometimes it's down to leaving reference until the end. I think I will reference
mm.
it later, but then you forget. And then,
I hear it so often. People are saying, "Oh no, it's fine. I'll do my references at the end." No, I'm not even
yeah,
going to look at your work. Sometimes you get some modules that you can actually give feedback on pieces of work or parts of the work
yeah,
ahead of time, and sometimes they think not doing the referencing is okay, and it's
I know.
always a no-no.
It's a common
Always a
mistake, and I
no-no.
think it just makes the work more difficult at the end if you have to remember exactly where you got all these pieces of information.
Yeah.
And that's when you probably end up having the mistake then of presenting work that isn't your own, and you've not. And the key thing, I
Yes.
think, just is the thing about acknowledging. So we're not saying you shouldn't read materials and use
Mhm.
information from these materials. In fact, that's part of what research is all about, isn't it? We want our students to
Yes.
research. You want to show that you've actually put in that work to bring in different views, and then that could help your analysis. But it's remembering to acknowledge. I say to my students sometimes, where did you get it from? All right. So
Yeah.
you've written a paragraph. Where did you get that information from? Just a simple question like that can remind you, prompt that
Mm,
referencing, which then takes away the idea of plagiarism as well.
super. Well, it sounds to me like if you get to some sort of approach, because for some students, when they've just started their law degree, I mean, we've got new starters every year,
Yeah.
and everything is so new, and it's daunting, isn't it? But you have to find a way that works best for you and just stick to it, because I think what we're talking about here and what the message that you're sending, straightforward a message is academic integrity,
Yes.
and take ownership for the mistakes as well. To deal with the mistakes
Yeah.
beforehand before you actually have to get to the APO hearing.
It's true. We're
Um,
trying to
so
avoid
so yeah,
needing to come before the APO.
yeah. But when it's about academic integrity, so how do we help students, or what could you say for students that um there is must be something that they can ensure a way of maintaining that academic integrity.
Yes. Um, I think there are a couple of things, practical things, and they're simple enough. So not complicated, but I think it's just remembering that. So I would say transparency when you're thinking about your sources. So reference the source, just be transparent about where you got the information, because I know we mentioned that we could have unintentional, but there could be also intentional plagiarism where there's that attempt to say, this is a brilliant idea. I want
Mm,
my lecturer to think I have come up with this idea so I can get credit for that idea and get, the top mark. Um,
mm,
but I think being transparent about where we've got the information from really makes a difference. Also, developing good habits of critical analysis. So if I've got the information, if I process it, so if I'm in my writing, I think, okay, I've read this and this author says this other author says that. What do I say? How do I see this? Reflecting, in a way, reflecting on that. So do you agree? Do you not agree? Why do you disagree or agree? And those sort of hard skills, critical analysis, can actually help to avoid plagiarism, because in doing that, you'll be bringing your own contribution into that essay, which then will move away from just presenting the work of others as if it was your own piece of work. And
Mm.
so confidence, I think sometimes, and I put my hand up as well. I mean, we've been students, been through this process where, and sometimes you're not confident in what you think you can bring to the table, so to
Yeah.
speak. It's like all these professors have written this, all of these big researchers have written this. What
Yeah.
do I have to say? But actually, you do have something to say. And
Mm.
if you add that to your work, I think that really enhances the academic integrity of that piece of work.
That's brilliant. Very, very good advice. But anything like step by step wise. So do you have any tips, I suppose, as to how to make sure um, you're properly attributing these sources,
Yes,
in your writing?
yes. So cite your sources as you use the information. That's the first thing I would say. So I've read this information. I'm going to include it in my work. First of all, refrain from copying and pasting. You might say, I'm going to copy and paste and I will rephrase it later. It's likely that you could forget.
Oh,
So,
yes.
so I would say when you read it, just paraphrase it. Write what you write should be your paraphrase of what you've written, and then immediately footnote it at that point.
Mm,
And we use your scholar referencing, but put that immediately there. So paraphrasing is really important. Summarizing the legal argument. What is the key thing that this author is saying, and how can I say it? Sometimes
mm,
try to recount it, as in actually speak it out, not just in my head. Okay, so if I was to explain this, I would say, if I were to explain this concept to somebody, what would I say? Okay,
mm.
so I verbalize it, and then it gives me, in a way, you are paraphrasing as you are describing that, and it gives you an idea of how to rewrite it. Only use quotes when it's really essential, absolutely essential, to take exactly that bit. But obviously, if it's a quote, you want to be putting the quotation marks and immediately referencing that source as well. Yeah.
Super, wonderful. So there is a way to do that properly. But very often you'd hear a student, yes, but I am talking, or I'm required to talk, and obviously we're not telling them to reinvent the wheel,
Yeah.
but you're required to talk about case law, legal precedents. You're required to talk about material that is already there. Yes, I have to say my bit about it, but how it comes to that originality.
Yeah.
But how are you being original in what you are producing by talking about the same thing that other peers doing the same assessment might be writing about?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I think we mentioned before that we're expecting students to read materials. In fact, if students submit a piece of work and there is no case law in it or no reference to a journal, we would be thinking, what on earth is this? Yes, where have you got your information? So yes, we do rely on those things. But I think originality, a key part of originality really centers on how the particular student, how the individual interprets, applies and analyzes the law. So, yes, the same case can be cited, but how you interpret what has been said, how you apply it to the particular facts, for example, if it's a problem question, or to the essay question that you're looking at, then becomes your original contribution to that piece of work. So you could have, I don't know, even 100 students read exactly the same material in terms of the sources, but how we're going to present it would not be exactly the same. And so I think for a student thinking, oh, maybe I can't be original because we're using the same sources, I wouldn't want the student to worry so much about that, because you can still achieve originality in your interpretation, in your application, and also analysis. And that's something that I think sometimes throws students off. We keep hearing, what is critical analysis? What does it mean? Analyze, analyze. Yeah. um, but it's something that is important because then it helps. So, for example, a simple way is let's say, the way you connect different cases that deal with the
Mm,
same issue. It's your analysis. That is something, that's a skill. Yeah.
mm.
Connecting that, and maybe also showing a distinction between the principle in one case and then how it's developed in another way, in another case. Those are things that you can bring in that actually shows originality, and keeps you away from that aspect of plagiarism. Um, Also interpreting legal sources. So um, if I refer to, I don't know, an act of parliament or an international treaty, giving some context and giving a bit more explanation to that, is it could help to ensure originality in that piece of work rather than just citing it and leaving it at that point.
Yeah, I like that you use examples, but also you're giving tips to students. At least with the examples, maybe they can make sense of them a
Mm,
little bit easier because
yeah,
obviously any student might be looking at this and consuming this information and thinking, well, I'm only a first year student. What do
yeah,
I understand about? Um, but it's fine. Obviously, always read the information brief that you get with the
yes,
assessment and as long as you keep it within the lines. But obviously, what we're talking about here is essay questions, problem questions. You know, uh, I'm just thinking about eels, for example.
yeah,
We're not doing that much referencing in that sense, but plagiarism is still very relevant
mm,
because obviously we haven't yet talked about peer to peer. Someone um, peeking at your work,
yes,
perhaps
yeah,
without your knowledge, or even with your knowledge and saying, "Don't worry, I'm not going to copy anything," and it might transpire that your submission is quite similar to their submission. So that's also a form of
yeah,
plagiarism, and we also need to make students aware of that. So even
yeah.
though, again, I was given the example of eels just because we're very heavily talking about referencing the sources and referencing cases, legislation, and so forth, but also journal articles. But if your work doesn't have that involved in it, it doesn't mean that you can't be guilty of plagiarism.
Yeah, that's true. And even dare I say that you could even have cases of self-plagiarism as well as students go on with the course. So
Yes.
that could occur where you've submitted a piece of work before or for another module. It might be in the same module even, but then just lifting verbatim, copying parts of that and pasting into another
Mm,
piece of work. And I think when I've talked to students, a lot of times students are surprised. What, self-plagiarism? No, I thought it's my work. I can just do it again. I can. Um,
yeah.
but I think the way to understand it is to say, for every piece of work, we're talking about the credits you're getting. So you can't be given academic credits twice for exactly the same thing. Just copying, because sometimes we have um, points at which modules intersect. So it might
Mm,
be that something you're covering in this module links in with something else in another module, and you think, wow, I've done that assessment. I already have done the work. I'll just lift that portion of it, two
yeah.
pages out of that, and put in the next one. Saves time, doesn't it?
Yeah.
No,
No, yeah, don't do that either. Don't do
don't
that. You
do
can
that. Yeah.
self-plagiarize. Let's talk about proper citation then.
Hmm.
We're not going to talk too much because there will be one on referencing, there will be
Yes.
one on Oscola. Students already know that we're doing internally. We're doing an Oscola that you've got Oscola recordings. You've got a monthly Oscola workshop that you can attend. If you don't, look it up on Learning Zone. You'll find it. But yeah, let's talk about proper citation.
Yeah. So in the law school, we use a scholar referencing. So just mention that, throw that out there. And as Ellen has already said, there's a lot that has been done on that. So do not ignore. Yeah, so proper referencing, part of it is also using the proper citation system that we use, and that will be the scholar referencing system for law. And I think it's to remember that each type of or the different types of sources you use have a way that they should be referenced. So case law, for example, has a way to be referenced. Journal articles have a way to be referenced. International materials, international treaties and laws like that have a way to be referenced. Newspaper articles. even if it's a podcast or an online, each type of material you use has a different way to be referenced. So a common error I see is students using one style. Let's say this is how a journal article is referenced. I'm going to use exactly the same way to do a newspaper article, or I'm going to use the same thing to do like a blog or something else. There are differences, slight differences in how they're presented. So
Mm.
engage with a scholar. You don't have to, I say this and I hope I'm allowed to say this. You don't have to cram, you don't have to know it just in your head how it's done. Be practical. You can have the guide just there beside you
Mm.
as you do your work and just go to the relevant sections and apply it. You don't have to know
Mm.
it by heart and think I have to memorize how to reference. Yes, you can use your brain power for other things, but you can just have that there. It's simple, a little guide, and then that just goes with it. So remember that if you we don't have this very often, but sometimes you may have students exploring materials that are outside of the discipline, and there's other referencing styles of course that exist, and sometimes you might have that confusion of mixing two referencing styles. But just remember that, I think, with students, stick to a scholar, but remember different pieces of work or different sources have different ways that they're to be presented in the work.
And very often, I think that the origin of the sources that some students use tell them how to reference. This is how you reference it, but usually is Harvard type of
Harvard.
referencing. So make sure that you're not just lifting the reference, you're actually knowingly making the decision to reference it in that way and see what sort of piece of information it is, then take the guide, put that up against the right, it's a secondary source, then find the sources, journal article, whatever the case may be. And as a scholar is guiding you to do it like that. Again, I'm not
Mm,
going to belabor this, but I like how
mm,
you focus the point on that.
mm.
But you mentioned also paraphrasing earlier. Now, there is one way to paraphrase to avoid plagiarism because we need to make sure that, we're still using someone's work,
Yes,
we're though putting it in our own words, because that's what paraphrasing is
yes.
really. But how can we do so effectively and without losing any meaning from the text that we want to use?
Yes, that's such a key point because I mean, I talk of myself thinking of my own journey, even in academia. I think I found paraphrasing quite difficult because I always felt as if they've said it so well. How am I going to say this?
Yeah,
The words they've chosen are perfect. Yes.
I know. Oh God.
So, one thing is to remember that with paraphrasing, you're not just trying to take a few words out of the sentence or paragraph and then just put
Mm.
your own words. You're rewriting it all in your own words. And I think that's the first thing to note because sometimes I've heard students say, but I paraphrased it, but what they mean is I added 3 words or 4 words.
Yes.
And sometimes, sadly, doing that means that you actually even lose the meaning of the text. Sometimes the words added don't quite fit. It doesn't seem to make sense when you read it in that way. So I would say something I did when thinking about paraphrasing was to be friends with the thesaurus. Now I know students I say that
Yes,
is a,
yes,
but
I
I
know, I
found that
know.
very useful because I have to think of words that convey a similar meaning, but it's not exactly the same word. And so expanding your vocabulary is something that is important if you're going to paraphrase because they might be talking about something that maybe you're not familiar with. So you need to understand it. So you need something to help you understand it. So I would say practically
Mm.
using a thesaurus is important. It doesn't mean that it would always match exactly, but you kind of get the idea of the concept because one word can mean different things, can't it, in different contexts. So I find that as a practical tool to help with doing that. And then ensuring that. So write it again. There's no, you don't have to write it once.
Rewrite
Write
it,
it again.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. Mm.
How does that sound? Does that make sense? When you read yours and you go back to it, does it so you go back between the two things? So it seems a bit laborious, but you know what? If you're going to do good work, it does take some time,
Mm,
doesn't it, to really
it
produce
does.
work that is good. And when you get your grades, I think they'll be worth that effort that's put into
Yeah,
the work. Yeah.
example, exactly. So you mentioned it as tools. Are there any other tools that students, do you have any other secrets that you could share with us? I think this is the question I'm asking.
This is the crux of it. So yeah, use your
Oh yeah,
thesaurus
let
and
me
do
just
that.
ask you yeah, tell me your secrets,
Read it
Rachel.
again. Yeah, if you are so lucky to see that same thing cited in another piece of work, how did they write what that person,
Mm,
how did they convey that idea? And you will find that because that's the thing with academia, because people reference their sources, you will find that maybe if there's a key source, it's referred to in more than one piece of work, maybe more than one article. How did they still they convey that idea without saying exactly what the other person has
mm,
said? So in that way, it gets me thinking, okay, what I've paraphrased, is this in keeping with what the others have said? Now, you don't need, not every piece of work demands that level because some things you find it easy to paraphrase. But this is in situations where you are struggling to actually feel like you have paraphrased this effectively, then I would compare. I would look
mm.
at it in another piece of work, and thankfully, because authors cite their sources, you can easily compare and see how that work has been presented. You might even want to, and it's not like a legal thing, but you might want to just say pass that idea through somebody at home, recount this, talk about it again and see if it makes sense. Yes, if it
Yeah,
makes sense to them, then it might make sense. If you've got that option of somebody with you, or you can, say that to a fellow student or something like that without getting into people actually, like you've talked about, copying work and all of that stuff. But you can bounce your ideas around with other people as well.
I do like that you said that because ultimately what you want to make sure is that um, obviously you are paraphrasing, you're using material, so you're demonstrating your engagement with legal sources, but also you're not losing meaning in the sense that like the tip you were giving earlier in the sense of reading it out loud, reading it to yourself, read what they said. Does the
Mm,
bit that you wrote make sense in the same way? Because this is this is what it is. If it's just
yes.
you working on a piece of work, you don't want to give it to your law colleague that's doing the same assessment. You want to you Yes, you're going to give it to someone who doesn't necessarily understand law, and that is
Mm,
even better
yeah.
than giving it to someone who understands law, because sometimes we might even read, when we read it ourselves, we might even read something that isn't actually there because our brain wants it
Yeah.
to be there. Therefore, you're reading it with that knowledge in mind. This is why we're saying read it out loud. Don't just, look at the
Yeah.
paper, print it out, highlight it, whatever the case may be. These are very valuable tools. Um,
Yeah.
how can or how do you, as a lecturer, Rachel, how do you encourage students to develop good practices and avoid, as far as possible, obviously, plagiarism from the beginning?
Yeah. So I'll say something about just linking in with tools and then come back with a lecture. So when students are submitting their work, we have Turnitin, and the work is going to go through Turnitin. So that opportunity to pass the work through Turnitin and get that similarity score is really important. And I really want to encourage students not to overlook the importance of that. Turnitin can be a good tool to help you identify if this work could potentially, these are all potentials, and could potentially contain parts that could be looked at as being plagiarized. So when it's highlighting a high similarity score and you look through your work again and you see, maybe I didn't reference this or I didn't do that, that gives you an opportunity to
Mm,
make a change. So I really cannot overemphasize the importance of Turnitin as a tool. As lecturers, we're still going to be looking at that same similarity report. So as the student, when you have that option to submit your work early enough and just go have that report, it can flag up something that maybe you unintentionally had put in there and forgot to reference, just use that. There are even citation management tools like Zotero, EndNote, okay, some of this stuff as well. Depending on the levels, people might use those if you have quite a bit of referencing to do. And of course, your scholar manuals. But for us as educators, so highlighting these things, of course, letting students know that there are tools and ways to look at that, but emphasizing the importance of academic integrity in your work, I think it's something that we can do.
Mm,
I like to think of it as the student has something to contribute. You have something to contribute as a student. And if you were just to present someone else's work only and not actually include your own thoughts or your own ideas, then there's something missing there. You have a vital contribution. And I really love to make students believe in that, even from their first year, because I think the way you see yourself has a big impact in how you also do your assessments. So if I think I have nothing to offer, everyone's great, everyone's awesome, I'm just, have nothing, then I wouldn't try to analyze or give my take, whether I agree or not agree with particular things I've looked at. I'll just be trying to put as much in there and just submit that piece of work. But if I think, do you know what, I have something to say, then when I look at those sources, I'm reading them, but I'm also having a critical hat. I'm asking myself, do I agree with what they're saying? Okay. If I agree, why do I say I agree? If I don't, why not? Has somebody else said something else? Now, those sort of skills come from also a place of believing you have something that you can add. You may think it's two lines, add the two lines. You may think it's just a little thing. It might be a niggle. I also, as an educator, want to encourage students to trust their gut. You say, you might have an instinct. You think, I think this. Look at it and obviously support your work based on what you're reading. I
mm.
think the academic skills, building academic skills, and the Scholar Master classes and things like this are very good. Building academic skills, making students aware of great resources we have even in the library. All of this stuff can help to encourage students to develop good practice and avoid plagiarism.
Wonderful. I like that, and it's quite full on and informative for students. But we talked a lot about how to avoid it. But what if, it happens? What are the consequences? It's not the best thing to sort of to go to work like at the end, like
Yeah, I know.
uh, but we have to talk about this
Yes,
as well. What are the consequences, just so that we have a full picture of trying at all costs to
yes.
avoid plagiarizing when you're writing your legal your academic work.
Yeah. Yeah, it's good to talk about the consequences. And sometimes the consequences could also be a stimulant to avoid it, isn't it? Like you think, I don't want that, so I'm not going to do that.
Yes.
Um, so it can be on the low side. So when we think about, I'm just thinking now in terms of our DMU regulations and policies with regards to academic practice, we talk about what we might call poor academic practice and sort
Hmm.
of probably on the low end, maybe some unintentional, copying and pasting, maybe forgetting to reference a few words, not the whole thing, but just parts of the assessment, depending on the piece of work. You have that sort of lower scale, poor academic practice, where it could be, some form of disciplinary action. It could be maybe just fail that element of the work and you need to redo it. Um, but then you could be on the other scale where you think this is academic misconduct, is really an intentional act to pass off work as if it's the students. And depending on, it could be there might be other aggravating factors there. So it could lead to fail grades, if it's really, I mean, at the extreme, of course, will be expulsion. But that is an extreme situation when we think about academic misconduct. But I think for the individual, even apart from the academic side of things. I think, when you pass work off that's not yours, you have to think, especially as a law student, if you're going to practice, you've got to think about your ethics as a professional as well, and how you'd conduct yourself outside of your time at the university. So some of the things we do now have an impact on how we do things later. So you want to also consider that, I think, outside of even the penalties, so to speak, what sort of professional do you want to be?
Mm.
And then maybe that can guide how we conduct ourselves in terms of the assessments as well.
Behave, behave, behave.
I like that summary,
That's
Eleanor. That is perfect. Behave, behave, behave. The three B's.
Now, Rachel, we've gone through, I think, understanding plagiarism. We've gone through best practice and academic integrity, and we obviously talked about citations and how to do that properly, and obviously paraphrasing as well. And we talked about tools. You gave us some tips, and obviously educational approaches and the consequences. Are there any final tips that you might have for the students or anything else that you want to say or share with them in terms of how to avoid plagiarism in legal writing?
Yeah, I would say that just I have a checklist. It seems like the very basic thing, but just have a checklist before you submit your work. Yes. Have I referenced every source I've used in this piece of work? Just check that before you hit that final send button. Have I done this? And I mentioned this earlier. Just reference as you go along, but have that checklist at the end, just to check your work again before submitting it. And you have something to say as a student, so don't be afraid to put your own words into your writing and let us see what your ideas are. Let's have that contribution as well in your work.
That's brilliant. Well, Rachel, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And number 15, woohoo,
Woohoo!
milestone. I'm looking forward to number 20 already. Now, thank you for coming. Thank you for volunteering to be on the podcast. And I look forward to seeing all of the other students that want to hear more podcasts in our next one and the next one and the next, obviously. But do get in touch with me, Eleanor Tedosy, if you'd like to, or you might have a topic that you want to suggest, and I'll be looking forward to trying to unpack that with someone in the law school in our next podcast. So take care and see you soon. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.